So the next topic in this security and risk management domain for CISSP is professional ethics. Relatively simple concept, really, when it comes to dealing with security. A lot of security concepts and a lot of security policies are driven by ethics, right? The founder of computer ethics stated in areas of cybernetics and information feedback systems, sciences in 1940s was Norbert Wiener, and he published a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, and it essentially has become kind of the basis for computer ethics research and analysis in today's industry. And then there was a follow-on, Don Parker in the 1960s published a book called The Rules of Ethics in Information Processing, which was then further developed to the Code of Professional Conduct for ACM in 1973. Now, obviously, computing technology and the industry has changed quite a bit since the 40s and the 60s. However, the concept of ethical handling of information, using computers for ethical purposes and in an ethical manner hasn't really changed. The technology's changed, but the general concept hasn't changed. We did see, of course, in the 1980s, a significant rise in cybercrime, computer failure disasters. We see that today, right? You hear always about how these airlines, all these flights are being canceled because computers are failing, and so on. So the thing that really changed in the 80s is that prior to the 80s, in order to effectively penetrate a system or breach some sort of security barrier provided by a computing system, you had to have very specialized skills, and you also had to have a very expensive computing system or a lot of very specific resources to facilitate that, right? But over time, that has changed in that the technology has become less and less expensive, and it's become a lot easier to use. Meaning that we have scripts that we can run, there are GUI interfaces. I mean, if you look just at Kali Linux, which is a Linux platform that's designed specifically for penetration testing and security assessments, very easy to use. The tools are well documented. You can go out to YouTube and watch a video on how to utilize those tools. So obviously, the purpose of utilizing those tools is supposed to be, for ethical reasons, but obviously a lot of people use them for unethical reasons as well. So ethics in general apply to these principles, right? Ethics programs requirements outline minimal ethical standards that an individual should partake in to ensure that they're meeting these regulations. In 1991, the U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines for Organizations defined minimal ethical requirements for those organizations as well. This is where we start to get into the whole act of or concept of due diligence and due care. Ethical standards reduce the penalties in criminal cases if those particular minimums were met. In other words, if you were providing due diligence and a breach occurred, you would be less likely to be prosecuted than if you were not providing due diligence or due care. All right? Board members and organizational leaders have to understand compliance and ethical programs. That was one of the components that was included in the update to these guidelines, the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations, meaning that just because, it's the old adage, right? Ignorance of the law does not mean that you don't have to abide by the law. So the extension of that into the security space is that ignorance of guidelines and compliance regulations doesn't mean that you don't have to abide by those guidelines and compliance recommendations. All right, and within the realm of this U.S. federal sentencing guideline, there are some subsections that define some of the compliance and ethics requirements. Right, subsection A, the purpose of compliance in the ethics program. So why do we have this compliance? Why do we have this program? Well, how does it apply to our business? The 7 minimum requirements of that particular program. And then we have to go through and periodically assess our risks and modify those 7 requirements specific to that organization. We'll get into the details of these subsections a little bit later on. But for now, we're going to move on and talk about some principles and guidelines that address ethics in business operations. Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX, of 2002, so it was 2002, I got that right, applies directly to accounting reform. Again, this came out of the whole WorldCom scandal and the Enron scandal, where we have auditing and quality control component and independent auditing and controls and standards that regulate public accounting firms. So there's an auditing component, there's a quality control component, there's an ethical component, and so on. The new subsection, 406A of Regulation S-K, requires disclosure if there's a breach or if there's misconduct in an organization. So you have to have, number one, a written code of ethics that applies to all your senior level executives. You have to have waivers of written codes of ethics for those senior officers. And then you have to be able to identify changes in codes of ethics. So different types of documentation that applies to establishing these code of ethics in an organization. And if you don't have a code of ethics, you have to define why. We're a thinQtank Data is a Cisco partner. And part of our partnership agreement, which wasn't always the case in the past, is to establish that we have a documented code of ethics that we work by. And Cisco actually requires us to have that in order for us to be a partner of Cisco and in turn an extension of Cisco. So it's being incorporated in a lot of different environments today. Computer ethics topics that need to be addressed by you as a security administrator or a professional of computers in the workplace, right? How are those computers going to impact the health and how do they meet the job requirements, right? Ergonomics is a very important concept today, especially with individuals that are performing repetitive actions or sitting in front of a computer for an extended period of time. So as an organization, you have an ethical responsibility to ensure that the users of those computers remain healthy, okay? Computer crime, of course, that's a very basic concept. A lot of computer crimes committed by trusted personnel, whether it's espionage, just simple theft of intellectual property driven by greed, whatever it might be. You have to ensure privacy and anonymity. Computers have an innate ability to store information, distribute information, gather information. So the ability for those computers to share that personal information needs to be addressed. Intellectual property needs to be protected. Professional responsibility and globalization is a big concern as well. Business-to-business communication is more prevalent today than it was in the past, especially with cloud computing and global e-commerce, right? So there are global laws that you have to consider, education that you have to ensure that the employees get. There's information flows that need to be monitored and transactions that need to be monitored. And by the way, this information can be very detailed and specific. So it's important that that information is protected. And then it says here, information-rich and information-poor nations and information interpretation is something to consider as well. Information-rich nations have a responsibility for maintaining the integrity of that data, whereas information-poor nations generally are trying to capture that information or gather that information. There is, when I was writing this, I incorporated this because I thought, well, this would be pretty interesting. The computer game Falsehood, right? Computers prevent cheating and work with exact accuracy and correctly, meaning that computers are police. Not the case, right? Computers do whatever the user wants them to do. So they can be used for good, they can be used for bad. Use those powers for good, right? So just because something is done on a computer doesn't mean it's done correctly. They're exacting, they do exactly what the user does, but programs are written by humans, so they can have errors in them, they can have coding errors or compilation errors, they can be used in incorrect ways, and so on. The law-abiding citizen falsehood. Laws define a minimum standard for use. Users must consider their own actions. In other words, laws, and I mentioned this before in an earlier lesson, laws provide guidelines, but they don't necessarily guarantee enforcement, right? The deterrent to disobeying laws is directly related to the consequences of disobeying those laws, right? So a law itself doesn't ensure, if the speed warning says you're only allowed to go 25, what's to keep you from going more than 25? Well, yeah, we can use technology like cameras, speed cameras and whatnot, but even a speed camera can't stop you from speeding. It can just guarantee that you're going to get punished appropriately, right? So just because a law exists doesn't mean it's going to be abided by. Shatterproof falsehood. Belief that an action on a computer causes minimal harm regardless of that action. In other words, you might be able to chip away at something, but you're not going to shatter it, right? That's the analogy that they use there. Computers can be as dangerous as the user using them. Because, like I said, computers are exact. They do exactly what they're told to do, and they're not necessarily restricted. The candy from a baby falsehood. Actions easy to perform on a computer doesn't mean the actions are ethical or legal. All right? Just because something is easy to do doesn't mean it's right. The hacker falsehood. Motivations to learn and not gain profit. Hacktivism, often not ethical or legal. So you might have an individual that says, well, yeah, I broke into this computer system, but the ends should justify the means. In other words, my goal was to make sure that this company wasn't cheating people. Well, you still broke the law by breaking into the system. All right? You still broke the law. Whether it was, under what you perceive as a good reason or not, doesn't mean it's necessarily not legal. And by the way, it may not even still be ethical, right? Because one person's perception of what should be right or wrong is completely different than another person's perception of what should be right or wrong. Just look at our political environment today, and you can see that that exists everywhere, okay? The free information falsehood. Love this one, right? The internet is free. Data should be free. Everybody should be able to share everything. I shouldn't have to pay Microsoft for Office. It should just be free. I shouldn't have to pay for this book. It should just be free, right? Well, not in a capitalistic society. Maybe in a different environment that would be the case, but not in this case. All right. So hacking, hacktivism. Hacktivism, well, hacking in general is anything related to a crime or criminal activity. But hacktivism is somebody acting or performing, a hacking, performing some sort of hacking event based on the fact that they think that whatever they're doing is for the greater good of man, I guess you could say, right? It's any kind of subversive use of a computer or a computer network, and usually it's going to be done to promote some sort of political agenda or social change in the world, it obviously falls under the realm of this hacker culture and what we call hacker ethics, not necessarily generally considered to be ethical in most people's eyes, but in this hacker culture it might be considered to be ethical, right? And it falls under the guise of free speech, human rights, freedom of information and movement, etc. The actual term itself, hacktivism, has been around for a while. The cult of the dead cow, it was the one that originated this term or coined this phase way back in the day. CDC. It was the reason I know about this is because of where it came from. I went to Texas Tech University, and that's in Lubbock, Texas, and actually this cult of the dead cow was actually an organization formed in Lubbock, and kind of coined this phrase hacktivism, right? One of the only things that, besides Buddy Holly, that came out of Lubbock. All right. The concept of peer-to-peer file sharing, freenet, censorship resistant communication. In other words, being able to encrypt communications and the ability to communicate openly, all part of hacktivism. I think you guys get the idea, right? And it's still prevalent today. We see it on a daily basis. Computers being used to change life for the better, quote unquote. I like the way that's worded there. Change life for the better. That's generally what we classify hacktivism under. Okay. Ethics codes of conduct and resources. Many organizations adopt codes of ethics that define information handling practices. The code of fair information practice, right? And these bullet points will make perfect sense. Number one, no personal data record keeping system existence should be secret. Anybody that's storing information should be able to identify that information is being stored. Individuals know information about them exists and how that information is used. Individuals should have a way to correct false or inaccurate information. Organizations with that personally identifiable information have to assure reliability of the data for its intended use and prevent the data misuse, and people have to have a way of preventing that misuse. This sounds very familiar to what we saw in the last lesson with regard to how do we handle personally identifiable information. The Internet Architecture Board wrote a request for comment, 1087, that defines unethical and unacceptable activities. There's a lot more to that RFC than this, but I just pulled out this piece because I thought it was relevant to this particular slide. Anybody that gains unauthorized access to Internet resources is considered unethical. Anything that disrupts the intended use of the Internet, and no, it's not just for porn, right? That is considered to be unethical. Anything that wastes resources of people, capacity, or computers, meaning things like denial of service attacks and utilizing systems for what they're not intended for. Anything that destroys the integrity of a computer-based information system or compromises the privacy of an individual. All right? Not rocket science here. This is a pretty easy concept to understand. The Computer Ethics Institute published the 10 Commandments for Computer Ethics. And the ISC2 ethics Code of Ethics, or Code of Professional Ethics, is very similar to this. We'll see that on the next slide. All right. They did this in the form of thou shalt not or shalt, obviously, in reference to biblical functions, right? Thou shalt not use a computer to harm other people. Thou shalt not interfere with other people's computer work. Thou shalt not snoop around other people's computer files. Thou shalt not use computers to steal, use computers to bear false witness, copy or use proprietary software which you have not paid, use other people's computer resources without authorization, appropriate other people's intellectual output, and thou shalt think about social consequences of the program you are writing or the system you're designing. Always use computers in the ways that ensure consideration and respect for your fellow humans. These are literally the guidelines that were published by the Computer Ethics Institute. Now, you're not going to have to know those, but you're most likely going to have to know these because they're directly related to ISC squared. I don't know that they will directly ask you about these Code of Professional Ethics components, but something to be considered. The ISC squared Code of Professional Ethics defines a preamble and canons which ISC squared members have to abide to. In fact, when you go take your exam and you get your certification, one of the things that you have to agree to is this list of ethics. The preamble for the Code of Ethics. Safety of Commonwealth, duty to principles and to each other requires adherence to ethical standards of behavior. And the Code of Ethics are listed here. Protect society, Commonwealth, and the infrastructure. In other words, promote public trust in information and systems, promote prudent information security measures, strengthen integrity of public infrastructure, and discourage unsafe practice. Okay, that sounds like a pretty good guideline. Act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally. Tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and make your stakeholders aware of your actions. Observe contracts and agreements. Treat constituents fairly. Give prudent advice. Be truthful, objective, cautious, and act with competence. Competence is a very important concept, right? You have to be thoroughly educated and use that education in the best way possible. Provide diligent and competitive service to principals. Preserve values of systems, applications, and information. Respect trust given. Avoid conflicts of interest or appearance, and only render service which you are competent and qualified to do. And then finally, advance and protect the profession. Sponsor qualified individuals. Remember I said that when you guys go get your certification, you have to be sponsored by another individual. Avoid association with practices that diminish the profession. Don't injure reputation of other professionals, and maintain competence, skills, and knowledge. This is a big part of it too. Because security is ever changing and evolving, it's very important that you maintain your skills. So there is a continuing education component to this, and ISC squared expects you to maintain that as you maintain your certification. I read those bullet points to you specifically because obviously it's directly related to ISC squared. So it's likely that you'll see those on the exam. All right. Another guideline, I guess you would say, the ethical basis for IT decisions. This was developed by a few individuals related to ethics, and it's going to be the same concept that we saw in the previous two examples. All right. Again, just general recommendations developed by Fritz Group, Group A, I guess you say, Timothy Garcia J. and William Kuchler, I don't know. You don't need to know that for the test. The golden rule: treat others as if you want to be treated. Okay? Do not implement systems you would not use yourself. Kant's categorical imperative: actions are not right for someone, are not right for anyone. Descartes' rule of change, the slippery slope: an action not repeatable at all times is not right at any time. The utilitarian principle, universalism: take action to achieve most good and put the values on those outcomes, where the ends actually does, in this case, justify the means. The risk aversion principle: incur least hard or cost when alternatives have varying degree of harm or gain. I don't know what that means. Let me rephrase that because that's not written very well. Incur least hard or cost when alternatives have varying degree of harm or gain. The concept that we're trying to say here, I'm going to have to reword that, but is that you want to implement risk aversion techniques based on a scale of the harm that the risk will cause to your organization, individual, or property, and the cost of mitigating that risk, right? That's that risk aversion principle. We'll get into a lot more detail on that as we move forward through the rest of the lessons. Avoid harm: protective obligation of companies to protect customers and clients from systems with known harm. No free lunch: assume all information belongs to somebody. Legalism: is it against the law? This is black and white, right? Moral actions may not be legal. It's easy to define illegal actions. It's a lot less easy or more difficult to define actions that may be legal but not ethical. All right? Always act in a professional way. Does the action that you're partaking in, is it contrary to your code of ethics? Okay? Evidentiary guidance, continuation from the previous slide. Hard data to support or deny the value of taking an action. All right? So you have a policy within your organization, and that policy drives your controls, technical, administrative, and physical controls, and your actions, right? So you need to have data that supports or denies the value of taking that action. I didn't take this action because of this, or I did take this action because of this. All right? The client, customer, patient choice. Let people affected decide as data owners. Well, let me reword this. Let the people affected decide, because they're the data owners. They have the right to self-determination of what happens with their data. Okay? Equity. Are the costs and benefits equally distributed? Or equitably distributed, I guess I should say. Similar people should have the same access to data and systems. Similar people meaning what? Meaning similar people that perform the same job function or have the same responsibility for information assurance. That doesn't mean that everybody across the board has access to data. It depends on what your responsibilities are within the organization, what your role is within the organization. All right. Competition. Consumers can select among competing companies based on consideration of privacy, cost, and quality. That's the American way, isn't it? Compassion, last chance. Assist most vulnerable parties and refuse to take unfair advantage of users with no technical knowledge. This is, quite frankly, how almost all social engineering experiments happen, right? When I was describing my relative being manipulated by these folks overseas about getting access to their computer, this is one of those points that was being taken advantage of, right? She was vulnerable because she didn't have a lot of technical knowledge. Impartiality and objectivity. Decisions not made in favor of one group or another, and IT professionals should avoid conflicts of interest. Openness, full disclosure. Anybody affected by systems have to be aware of that existence. of the data that was collected and how the data was used. Confidentiality, data has to be protected, and trustworthiness and honesty. IT professionals should stand behind ethical principles and be accountable. Okay? Again, guys, this is not rocket science. You understand what we're talking about here. We pretty much operate in our daily lives with these principles, right? We're just extending these principles to technology and information, but it's not difficult to understand. So with regard to the CISSP and the application of the Code of Ethics, there are really kind of two different areas that you focus on. The security professional, which is what you guys are or are becoming, you're the ones that have to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information. The Code of Ethics is really kind of considered as a contract, and it's not a contract that you necessarily assign, although you will check a box at one point or another on your path to getting your CISSP that says that you have to follow this particular guideline. Okay, but that is a contract between you and the governing bodies or the entities that are responsible for maintaining your standards, right? There are 5 essential ethical principles, and when you guys are doing your exam, as long as you keep these 5 principles in mind, when you look at your scenario-based questions, a lot of the questions are going to fall under these kind of categories, right? Informed consent, that's pretty easy to understand. Make sure that the people that are affected by the decisions, policy decisions, technology decisions, etc., are aware. The higher ethic in the worst case, meaning what? It means to kind of err on the side of caution. You know, actions that are taken on the small scale, excuse me, I'm reading the wrong one. Consider options and select one that will cause the least harm, right? Change of scale test. Actions taken on a small scale could result in great harm if executed on a large scale. We call that the avalanche effect. We see this in cryptography as well. A small change could potentially result in a big impact if it's applied on a larger scale. Conservation of ownership. The person responsible for the information always ensures the information is reasonably protected, being the custodian of that information. And the user's conservation of ownership always assume that others own the information, and the owner's interest has to be protected unless explicitly authorized otherwise. Okay? So the owner of the information is not always the person responsible for maintaining the security of that information. It's usually the custodian or the user of the information that's responsible for maintaining that information. All right? So that wraps up this lesson. We're going to go on and get into looking at some more technical things like security policies. How do I develop a security policy? How do I implement a security policy? And so on.